So, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this Transport Planning Society webinar. My name is Ben Plowden, and I'm the chair of the Transport Planning Society, and it's my pleasure to be chairing today's event. This is one of a number of series of webinars we're holding in the run-up to our annual Transport Planning Day, which is this year on the 11th of November at the Institution for Civil Engineers in London, but also available online. And the topic of this year's TP Day is the principles, policies, practicalities, and politics of reducing car use in the UK. And we've got a number of very distinguished speakers, including, I'm delighted to say, the Minister, Lilian Greenwood MP, who's the Minister for the Future of Roads, who will be our keynote speaker at TP Day. So if you haven't already signed up to TP Day, I encourage you to do so, which you can do on the Transport Planning Society website. The topic of car use reduction is obviously very current. A number of organisations, including the Climate Change Committee, have said that unless we find a way of reducing total car travel, we will not achieve our decarbonisation goals for transport, amongst other goals that we might want to achieve. And whenever discussions about car use reduction come up, the issue about how we might achieve that in rural areas very quickly comes to the fore, simply because, at least at first glance, it's more difficult to think about how you might reduce car use in rural areas, given the relative difficulty providing conventional public transport, at least in rural areas, the fact that there are longer distances involved, one might assume, hence making walking cycling more difficult. So that's why we're having today's webinar, which is to address exactly that question. What are the practicalities and politics, if you like, of reducing car use in rural areas in a way that continues to support communities there, many of whom are suffering quite significant economic challenges. So to help us do that, we've got three very distinguished speakers who I'll introduce one at a time in a minute. And just to explain how we're going to do this, I will introduce the speakers one at a time. They all give relatively short presentations, sort of summarising their views on the question about car use reduction in rural areas. And then we'll throw the conversation open to all of you through questions, which you can post, I think, on the YouTube channel, and then we'll see those on our side of the process. And then what I'll do is put those questions either to all the panelists or to a particular one if the question seems to be particularly relevant. So without further ado, let's get on with the presentations. Our first speaker today is Stephen Joseph, who is a very well-known, I'm sure, to all of you, transport policy consultant who specialises in urban and local issues and in smart transport. He was for many years the chief executive of the Campaign for Better Transport, formerly Transport 2000. Stephen, for 30 years, I think it says in your note, 1988 to 2018. And he's now the professor of at the University of Hertfordshire Smart Mobility Unit, having received an honorary doctorate from the university in November 2010. As well as his role at Hertfordshire, Stephen is a trustee and chair of the Foundation for Integrated Transport, and in particular director of the Transport for New Homes project, which the foundation established. So Stephen, over to you, tackling car use in rural areas.
Thank you, Ben, and we'll try and see whether this works. I hope that's working. Right. This is the Smart Mobility Unit. It does teaching, research. The university walks the walk because it has its own bus company, Uno, and its own travel plan. And we've done consultancy work for the Transport Planning Society on producing 2 reports on the state of the nations on transport planning. We do workshops, and we have our own masters in transport planning, which the GPS with CIHT validates. Now, we've been running roundtables looking at the future of transport outside cities, and there's actually been very little research on this. And transport planning tends to focus on cities, but rural and peri-urban areas outside cities need attention. Typically, such areas, you've got prosperous high car ownership, severe traffic congestion. In many cases, you've got no large cities, several smaller towns, and places like Hertfordshire, or for that matter, Warwickshire or Worcestershire, are at the edge of city regions. They've generally got relatively poor public transport, and they've got also substantial house building. And we've been running round tables. We're now running more with Transport East. You'll hear more about that from Sharon in a minute, as a rural transport learning network. This is the the story on carbon emissions. Shire County's transport carbon emissions per head are double those in London, 2/3 higher than metropolitan districts, and urban rural districts outside conurbations, 60% of the population, 72% of transport carbon. Rural transport also matters because of social exclusion. Those without car access in rural areas face reduced access to employment, education and services. This is a study from Transport for the North. 21% of people in the north of England are at risk of transport-related social exclusion, especially in coastal communities and former industrial areas. Now, the good news from our roundtables is there are mean ways of challenging these, of tackling these challenges and impacts. It is possible to have better, good rural public transport. Active travel can be a real option for travel outside cities. Travel planning with employers and schools can reduce car use even in rural areas. New technology brings new travel options, and new housing does not have to be car-based. I'll go through these one by one. So on rural public transport, we've found, for example, Transport for Cornwall Cornwall Council has been slowly bringing together packages of better public transport with integrated timetables. The buses meet the trains, good interchanges, single ticketing systems, reduced fares, and they've improved the branch lines. They're continuing to do that. Work's going on at the moment to create what they call the Mid-Cornwall Metro, linking Newquay to Truro and Falmouth, with passing loops, extra trains, extra platforms, and so on. And other areas who have new bus funding are also doing more of this, places like Norfolk and Cambridgeshire. Rural rail lines can be upgraded. We've heard from Community Rail Network about that. And we've seen Greater Anglia upgrading all their branch lines with new trains, which are level boarding and with more carriages and, unsurprisingly, therefore more use. Demand responsive transport is a thing we've looked at a lot. There's been much debate about this, but I think there's an agreement, even among some people who are very suspicious of it, that there is a clear case for some types of demand responsive transport, and there are different sorts. I think we'll hear from Beata later about some of those. You get providers like Beervan, you get generally aggregators like Zelo and Ride Tandem, who aggregate demand and do contracts with everybody from taxi companies to coaches to bring in employees, for example, and there are software providers with back office support like Pedam. This is the Herts Links DLT scheme in North Hertfordshire. I'm indebted actually to Beata for the diagrams at the top, which show access, which shows the accessibility of public transport before and after the DLT. And the highest user groups here are 16+ students going to the college in Buntingford and rail commuters, and both were previously used cars. So there's clearly an example here of DLT that has enabled some reductions in car use and carbon emissions. And the platform now includes Dial-A-Ride, and there are possible extensions, including school travel, special educational needs, community transport, maybe even non-emergency patient transport. So that's an example of a DLT scheme. Short distance car trips, lots, even in rural areas, a lot are very short. Walking and cycling replace some of these. There are opportunities for walking and cycling school streets. Cycle parking at railway stations in rural areas is often well used. And you can have green routes as part of neighbourhood plans. Deepings in Lincolnshire have put green walks into their neighbourhood plan, though there's a need to give pedestrians and cyclists priority along and across main roads. Extending this are e-bikes. There's good research from the previous Centre for Research and Energy Demand on e-bikes' ability to slash transport emissions, because they make cycling easier and more attractive. E-cargo bikes can be used for deliveries. That's the Cargodale picture on the top left. Again, Beata was involved in setting that up. Provide deliveries even in quite small and hilly places. And we're seeing bike share spreading out, bike share schemes spreading out from cities into smaller towns like Watford. And there are 302 bikes, 110 bays in 4 Cornwall towns now. A critical thing in reducing car use and carbon emissions is tackling the journey to work. And we've seen particularly Mobility Ways, quick plug, they've got a zero carbon commuting seminar, a webinar tomorrow. They've been working with employers to move to net zero commuting. They use that dashboard on the bottom right to measure average carbon emissions and to work out ways of reducing it. I point that that map at the top shows them mapping where employees are coming from and opportunities for grouping them on existing or bespoke bus services, car sharing, pool bikes, and so on. And they make the point that in terms of traffic and carbon emissions, a small proportion of car use is long distance journeys, of which a lot of them are commuting, and that therefore even moving to car sharing can reduce car use even in quite rural areas. And they're doing a lot of work with individual employers, hospitals and others. Again, the roundtables have heard that. Tourism and visitor travel, big issue. Leisure travel accounts for the most mileage in the UK, most by car, and we've seen opportunities of change in places like Snowdonia. There are opportunities in places like Good Journey and the Eco Attractions Group who are doing this. And there's international good practice on sustainable tourism and travel. Though travel at destinations, it's easier to change the travel to destinations. And we've heard that fragmented governance in places like national parks makes action on transport difficult. And there are other issues that have come from the roundtables. Resilience, disruption to transport networks in rural areas has different and sometimes greater impact than urban areas. Issues of regulation, issues of funding, the need for long-term funding for rural transport, community involvement, community-led initiatives, and also spatial planning, where new homes are built and the layout design will have impacts on travel and emissions. This is from the Transport for New Homes that Ben mentioned in the introduction. Research showing traffic building by building housing in the wrong place, and homes without connections to pedestrians, cyclists and buses. But better practice does exist. Places like Kidbrooke and Panbury, New Lubbersthorpe, that picture at the top right, is a development next to Leicester, which had demand responsive transport buses from day one, which have now built up to fixed route. And Create Street, Sustrans and Transport for New Homes did an alternative plan for Chippenham and its urban extension, which reduced carbon by 2,000 tonnes a day. Cardmo share went down from 72 to 46% in the modelling. So there are opportunities to do better things with new housing developments. And bringing it all together, we've seen the development of mobility hubs. That's one in Scotland at the top left. Delivery hubs with cargo bikes, first, last mile, linking different rural transport contracts together that I've mentioned, and joint ticketing and information, mobility as a service, even in the Highlands. And we've seen from the local sustainable transport fund that travel behaviour can change. And in some of these areas, we saw reductions in car commuting and carbon emissions. And so from conclusion to this, and I am speeding up rapidly, it's possible to cut car mileage and give places outside cities good alternatives to private car use. Universal SUV use is not the only option. We found that the roundtables have brought together a wide range of groups and organisations working on aspects of rural mobility. We've showcased many different interesting projects and initiatives. There's more research is needed because anybody from university will say that, but in this case it's really needed. And there are opportunities to join up and make better use of existing transport. We need new governance structures, long-term funding and revised regulations to help this. And there's a just transition issue. New approaches to rural mobility need to be inclusive, involve local communities and include the needs of women, children and older people in their journeys and support low-income groups. Here's where the write-ups are, if you want to see those. The most recent ones are on the Transport East site as well. And I think that's me. Thank you very much.
Stephen, fantastic. Thank you very much. A real whistle-stop tour of what's going on, and also very encouraging to hear that in real life there are things going on that are demonstrating that you can give people access to good services and opportunities without them necessarily having to own or use a household car. Just one question for me before.
We just say that these slides are going to be available afterwards, aren't we?
Yeah. Yes.
So people will be able to see them.
Yeah. You mentioned briefly funding. I'm interested to understand sort of two resourcing issues, Stephen. One is what sorts of funding, obviously long term is better than short term, but what sorts of funding do you think would have the most benefit in terms of supporting rural transport provision? And secondly, what about resourcing more generally, in particular for local authorities, who I suspect are, you know, pretty down to the wire in terms of staff and capability, certainly in some parts of the country. So in kind of the kind of broad resourcing of this effort, what do you think we need?
Yes, I think, well, I think you'll hear from Sharon on some of this as well, actually. But I think I think firstly, we need to see the Transforming Cities Fund type approach of long-term capital funding taken outside cities to other authorities. And maybe that will happen with general devolution, but we'll have to see that. But secondly, we do need revenue funding here. I think one of the things that's clear is that just as we cross subsidize rural energy, postal services, and so on from their national networks, we need to recognize that the links into rural areas are not ones that are going to be to make lots of money, but for the reasons I've mentioned on carbon and social exclusion. These are links that matter. Actually, I did hear Keir Starmer talking this morning about the importance of buses to pensioners. So it's clear that at least at that level, that message has got through, that buses are important. And our work, these roundtables, has shown just how important they are in terms of people being able to access jobs and training and education. So that needs to be paid for. And I think we need to that needs to be recognised through long-term funding settlements. But I mentioned the governance issue. I think the governance issue in rural areas is a particular issue. National parks, obviously, but also more generally. And again, the devolution, the moves on devolution on mayoral combined authorities and so on may take that forward.
Right. Not often you hear prime ministers talking about buses and pensions in the same sentence. That's quite encouraging. Stephen, thank you very much. We'll come back to you, I'm sure, a bit later on for further questions from people on the call. So next up is Sharon Payne. Sharon is the Regional Rural Mobility Manager at Transport East, which is a subnational transport body for the eastern part of England. She's heading up a very exciting area of work, leading on delivering the National Rural Transport Mobility Centre of Excellence, engaging a wide variety of stakeholders from central government, academia, tourism, and business. And the Centre of Excellence is focusing on research, evidence building, and continuing to make the case for investment in rural transport along the lines that Stephen's just mentioned, and the challenges face an area which has typically been omitted from both national and regional research policy in recent years. Sharon had an extensive career in local government before she joined Transport East, and therefore has been at the coalface of a lot of these issues during her career. Sharon, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my presentation. Can you see that? Yep, perfect. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for that introduction, Ben. As I've said, we've got Transport East, who are the subnational transport body for the east of England. We have about 1 million people, just over 1 million people in our region who live in rural areas. We have a third of the population living along the coastline. There's around 500 miles of coastline in the east. We also consider 2/3 of our population to live in transport deserts. So this is where people have lack of access to regular public transport or sustainable transport options, but also poor digital connectivity. We think that poor digital connectivity also affects the way that people access some transport services as well. So in 2022, with support from Department for Transport, the Rural Mobility Centre of Excellence was established. So in terms of what the Centre of Excellence is for, it's multifaceted. Stephen and Ben have both said about the long-standing focus on improving outcomes in urban areas, the amount of funding that has gone into urban areas to reduce congestion, improve journey times, decarbonise trips in towns and cities. That hasn't happened in rural areas. As Stephen said as well, lack of focus on research. into rural transport. There's nothing that has been substantial enough to influence government policy direction, and local authorities have then not been able to kind of make decisions in their local plan making and local transport plans to support rural transport. So through the Centre of Excellence, we're working with a range of partners and stakeholders to fill in some of those gaps in evidence, understand the more qualitative issues of rural transport for the people living and working there, also for the local authorities delivering services in those areas. And then I would say, probably without blowing the trumpet for the Centre of Excellence, but in 2 years we've achieved quite a lot and kind of become a well-recognised and trusted point of contact for rural mobility. But I would say there is still a lot more to do. So, as you heard, we are the lead subnational transport body for rural mobility. So I work very closely with the 6 other STBs on rural transport issues. So we facilitate a national picture. We also provide a centralised point of contact for DfT, who sit on that group, other government directorates as well, as we make contact. And it also provides a sort of a single line of contact and a reliable sort of conversation. So as Stephen said, the roundtables that we've been running over the last year have been incredibly successful. We've had a wide range of topics. We've looked at planning and development, public transport use, tourism and leisure, which I think was probably one of the more interesting conversations for people who joined that, because it's something that in the whole is not generally covered by local transport authorities, and yet has a lot of significant impact on local transport networks, especially in coastal and rural areas. The national group also has been able to ensure that we've been able to put a rural focus on some of the funding opportunities that have been coming forwards. There was £3 million allocated through the Future of Rural Transport policy document that DfT published last year. And we've got around just under 20, I think, rural pilots now being delivered across 2 of those funding programmes. So those are happening specifically with rural ring-fenced funding on decarbonisation and accelerating innovation. So what have we been doing within the Centre of Excellence? We've been doing a lot of work to ensure that we bring together different stakeholders and partners, quite often outside of traditional transport roles. We've done a piece of work to get a more grassroots, community level understanding of accessibility to local services. So on the right-hand side of the slide there, you can see some screenshots from our Rural Mobility Parish Access Dashboard. We asked parish councils to look at 15 services that you would expect to be able to access in everyday life, and whether or not they actually had to travel, or residents in those parishes had to travel. We found that most residents are having to travel outside of their local area to access key services. Even things like petrol stations, for example, are not found relatively local to where people live. We've been running workshops, webinars, regional meetings, looking at all things connected to rural transport. That has included active travel. We found that, implementing active travel schemes has been quite a challenge in rural areas, and the Active Travel Fund and the guidance has focused very much on urban connectivity. So we're also pleased to say that, there is Active Travel England's rural guidance being developed, and we've been having a good conversation with them about that and how we can feed what we've learnt so far into that work. So the stakeholders are diverse. We've got charities, academic settings, businesses, policy leads and beyond. And I would say, without having the centre as a cog in that wheel, we wouldn't be bringing these organisations together to talk about rural transport and rural mobility. It's quite ranged. That's just a snapshot of the people who we've engaged with. And we found that the Centre of Excellence role has actually helped to facilitate those conversations and put people in contact with each other. The UK isn't that big, but local authority officers are incredibly busy all the time. Having the Centre of Excellence and someone who just focuses on rural transport has been a huge benefit in helping to make those connections. And as you know, I think DfT would say honestly, they have recognised this too, as a benefit of bringing together all of those conversations and all those discussions into one place. So the big piece of work we did last year, we ran our first strategy hub. So a deep dive into one particular topic. So obviously we took rural transport and mobility as our first topic to investigate. We asked stakeholders to submit written evidence in response to a number of key questions that we wanted to find out more about. We had a range of respondents. So you can see those sort of logos in the middle of the slide there to show you the kind of people or kind of organisations in the east of England who we were able to engage with, businesses, tourism sector, SMEs, really big businesses. You know, you've got a couple of big brand names there, I would say, who are all have a significant role in the east of England. We ran some focus groups with them as well, to tease out and expand on the initial findings. And we also sort of themed those sessions so that people could have a really good conversation, and look at what we were doing and how they could input into that. And the findings were absolutely amazing. To have those focus groups and to have the conversations around rural transport has massively expanded our evidence base. The Rural Connections report runs to just under 100 pages, but there is a summary document that you can peruse. And through that, what we've got is a number of recommendations, and I won't run through them, but we've got recommendations for local government and public sector partners, for national government and national policy making, and then for Transport East to continue working through as the centre of excellence. So that research, we found a lot around issues about attracting and retaining employees, due to businesses in rural locations and limited transport options. We found that some of the larger employers can provide support initiatives. So they've been able to collaborate with public transport providers. Some have been filling the gap and ensuring that they have, you know, comprehensive staffing by providing their own transport services as well. However, that doesn't necessarily translate to the SME sector. Around a quarter of all businesses in the rural areas are predominantly SMEs, and they employ around a third of the workforce. So there's a lot of people affected. We heard from the VCS sector. So they talked about insufficient transport options for the people that they work with and support. That increases social isolation. It affects people's mental health, their physical health as well, and their social mobility. Some of the challenges seem to be more pronounced for younger and older generations, and also particular impacts on people with disabilities and additional accessibility needs. But what we found throughout our last couple of years of research is where transport services do exist in rural areas, communities use them and they really value them. However, the things that they struggle with are poor connectivity. So, you know, there isn't necessarily an integrated transport system in rural areas. For example, rural train stations, which are unmanned, they don't have frequent services, lack of service update for passengers doesn't happen. And so what is happening is that they are impacting on journey choices. And so car trips are happening because of that lack of faith in the system that exists. This slide, these two images have been shared by Suffolk County Council. It's in our Rural Connections report, but what you can see is that over 20 years, the reduction in bus services in that region. Across the country, bus services have reduced, but for example, here, what we're finding is that we have a lot of deprived rural communities along the coastline, where we can see that there have been quite distinctive reductions in services. And also, as Ben, I think you alluded to earlier, said people are travelling further. I think people in rural areas travel at least twice as far for everyday journeys. They are paying more out of their disposable income for those journeys, you know, just so that they can live and work where they want to. So again, enforced car use is being put upon a lot of people living in rural areas. And my last slide, what's working well? There is a lot that's already working well. Many of these have come to fruition through identifying local needs, and champions are leading on them. A lot are not delivered by local transport authorities, but voluntary community support groups and charities who, aren't necessarily transport professionals or operators. But I think there's also discrepancies in the availability of the different transport modes, choices and costs. So there are local and regional inequality based on different types of boundaries, whether it's administrative or funding. So through the Centre of Excellence, we'll continue to work with the new government to make sure that we can get rural mobility into these new transport strategies in its own right, not just a nice to have, and also continue to use that evidence base that we've got, the work with the roundtables and the research that's been going on to make sure that the government understands what's already out there, what's available to help them make their policy decisions, and hopefully some of that funding as well. And I think really my final thought is, as a collective of transport professionals here today, I think we should all continue to proactively address the views that access to transport services is a basic need. It should be met, and people in rural areas shouldn't be excluded at the cost of their urban counterparts. Thank you.
Sharon, well said. I'm sure everyone on the call would heartily agree with that last sentiment. Fantastic. And it's clear that you're providing a really critical role as the kind of the forum through which all the relevant stakeholders can engage in the conversation. I guess just a question from me, well, two actually. One is, to what extent do the solutions for people living in rural areas vary by rural area? Is it different in the uplands and the northeast compared to, say, the coastal region of East Anglia? And I guess the corollary question is, is there a kind of toolkit of things that you would say to a local area? You must have these 5 things. If you want to make a big change quickly, do these things. Improve bus services. Do you see what I mean? Is there a kind of list of things that's really obvious that an area has to provide in order to kind of dramatically improve access relatively quickly?
Yeah, I mean, certainly from the first point, Ben, around, is it different? Yeah, hugely across the country. There are some really good examples of good practice. And we've got a literature review on our website that has kind of looked at these across different modes. And it just depends on funding, and different things are funded differently as well. One of the local authorities I'm working with is providing community transport services and DRT services, even though they are not a transport authority, but because they think it's of a benefit to their residents as well. So, that's coming out of a district council budget rather than a county council budget. And I think as well, going and talking to the communities rather than as a transport planner or, a transport strategy person, thinking that is what's best for them. Not all solutions are appropriate for the communities that you're trying to engage with. That there is an element of behaviour change, that you need to be able to provide the services that people want in order to make those choices as well. So in the same way that, it's about EV charging, and where do you put EV charging in rural areas in order to try and help facilitate EV uptake. Not every single rural area is going to have a big community that wants to go out and buy an electric car straight away and change their travel habits.
Great, thank you very much. So again, we'll come back to you, I'm sure, in questions a bit later on. So our third speaker today is Beata Kubitz. Beata is an expert in future mobility and the role it plays in carbon reduction, and her specialist consultancy provides research, innovation and policy development at both national and local level. She is a course contributor and lecturer at the Future Mobility Programme for Operational Transport Planning module at the MSc of Transport Planning at the University of Hertfordshire, where Stephen also is. And in 2020, she was awarded a fellowship by the Foundation for Integrated Transport to develop research into the impact of rural mobility on city centre traffic. And then finally, Beata is the co-author with my TPS board colleague James Gleave of a recent book called Mobility as a Service: Its Development, Deployment and Future. Beata, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. This is a presentation. It will touch some of the things that Stephen touched on and some that Sharon touched on, but hopefully I'll bring you a bit of extra perspective from France at the end. One of the things I think that we kind of think of as rural, when we talk about rural transport in the UK, is that we think about the 17% of people who live in rural areas. But I think that we often have also all of the people who live between that very rural and city and the city urban conurbation to consider as well. So the 35% of people who live in cities who have very, very good transport, and then it gets worse and worse and worse as you get further and further away from those city centres. And I think there are probably more people who live in where in Europe we'd think of as having rural transport networks in the UK. As Sharon said, people travel much further if they live in rural settings. They travel nearly twice as far as a rural dweller as if they live in a very urban conurbation, with gradations in between. They make many more of those trips by car, unsurprisingly, and they make some of those trips less by active travel means, by walking and cycling, but they very, very much travel less by bus and rail, and that reflects some of the provision that's there for them. So they travel further because of trip length. It's further to go. Quite simply, if your homes are spread further apart in low density populations, it's further to see your friends, it's further to the shops, it's further to other amenities. And then simply the availability of modes is such that people are less well served by public and shared transport. And the active travel we can often put down to roads being dangerous. The picture at the bottom left is a housing estate in rural West Yorkshire. There is a school just around the brow of the hill and no continuous pavement between those people and that school. Would you let your child walk to school in these circumstances? We can see pavement simply coming to an end. This was outside of Birmingham. The end of the pavement was nigh. And then you also, if you're trying to walk and cycle on a rural road, which is national speed limit, in your hand cycle, you may be slightly at a disadvantage when it comes to cars. Rural transport active networks can be discontinuous. Top left picture. This is in Hebden Bridge in rural West Yorkshire again. My friend Simon on his wheelchair trike can't get any further than this spillway, which is covered by water. So, and that's on a national cycle network route as well, just for your delight and delectation. So the context is very fragmented, I would say, for rural transport. And I think the other speakers have really pointed to many of the issues. And we have a future of transport kind of a document, but it summarises very good case studies, but I feel there's not a comprehensive moving force at the moment. There's nothing bringing this together in an integrated network. And I think just to reinforce what Stephen and Sharon were saying, the transport networks need to extend into communities. We cannot be expecting people to walk 2 miles across a muddy field to access the once every 3 day bus and be exhorting them to do this as in the name of behaviour change. Those transport networks have to be there. Low frequency services aren't enough, and they have to come near people's houses. Which is why I'm quite a strong advocate of demand responsive transport, because it's something that enables people to have access to transport, even in rural areas. The HeartsLink service that Stephen was looking at is actually specifically designed so that it enables people to go in and out of in and out of the hub towns, but not travel around them. So it gives people in that rural area of Buntingford the ability to go to hospital in Stevenage or use the Royston train station. And if you look at the back end of that, you can actually see those destinations are among the most popular destinations. And if you compare those to the existing public transport networks, you can see that whilst the demand responsive transport may take longer than the car, it takes substantially longer, less time than the hour or 2 hours that it would require to make those same trips by the existing fixed line public transport network. So I think there's a good, it provides a facility that people really don't have in ways to fit in with their everyday lives. And it also means that a lot more people are served by regular public transport. Again, active travel, I can't say this often enough. I saw a picture in Stephen's presentation of a tiny patch of concrete with a bus stop in it. If you want people to travel to bus stops, they have to have the same safe infrastructure that people have in towns and cities, and the same level and quality of design. And this applies also to rural train stations. It was very difficult to travel away from Caman-Dursley because, again, it spills onto an A road. The buses are very, very infrequent, and the car park is almost always full. And that shows in the station usage for that particular station. Comparing it with my West Yorkshire comparators, it has about a fifth of the passenger trips per year, even though it's on a main line to Bristol. So Caman-Dursley station, 3 mile long town with 15,000 people in it, but it's very difficult to access the train station other than by car, and the car park is too small for all of the people that want to do that. So solutions, slightly jollier. There are people in rural areas who are really happy to do things without using a car. There are car clubs, there is community transport. People have tried, as I did in West Yorkshire, cargo bike deliveries. That scheme's still going, and it's also helping people get active with e-bike trials and e-cargo bike trials. And that's partly down to the rural population not being homogenous. It's not all about people who don't want to share. Quite often they do want to share. And the mosaic profiling of rural populations can be very revealing in showing that there are people who are hard pressed and want to share because of that reason, or public spirited, or interested in carbon reduction and want to share their resources. Our car in Hebden Bridge is a rural car club, and the bottom left hand picture is people coming to Cargodale wanting to know how it was being done. So there's that willingness to share skills, share resources that quite often happens in rural areas. So don't despair of the population. Provide us with an alternative approach. And the alternative approach that I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to here is the French alternative approach, which actually is the Loi d'orientation sur la mobilité 2019, which gives every person in France the right to transport. And by transport, they mean public transport. And it's devolved that right down to regional departments and French government saying, in your region, how are you providing people with that ability to access public transport? It's not universal because some departments didn't have the competence at the time, so they're still developing that. But where it's happening pretty impressively, it has to be said. It's happening with trials of DRT in rural areas, switching over analog dial-a ride services to on-demand platforms, which is enabling a broader population to access those on-demand systems. And it's a very systematic approach to connectivity around cities. So outside of the urban areas, recognising that rural people have the same rights as to public transport as urban people. And it's often replacing poorly used services, off-peak services, fixed line services with on-demand services. And you see here Orléans, which is it's a big city in France. It has a dense urban core, but around the dense urban core, it has some very sparse rural areas. And all of those are connected to the dense urban core by demand responsive transport. And there's a recognition in Orléans that the city pays a subsidy to public transport overall, but it has managed to design this network so that the subsidy that is paid to the demand responsive transport system outside of the city matches per person the subsidy that's provided for the inner city population. And I think this is really important because the research that I did for the Foundation for Integrated Transport indicated that it's people driving into cities which create the bulk of the traffic within the city core. So you can't really solve that unless you take a broad area-based approach to transport. Very quickly, some of the solutions I've seen in France are very interesting. The fixed line buses, they go into far more sparsely populated areas than we probably see them in the UK. The top left picture is a village of 400 people. It's interesting. The bus takes priority. Clearly, if people are getting on and off the bus, your car will stop behind them. And if you can see the little tiny green sign in the middle of that, to the right of the middle of the picture, that's actually an advised covoiturage. You can put your thumb up, and it's a sort of state-sanctioned hitchhiking point. And there's a lot more kind of recognition that people may have to share resources. The bottom left picture is an aire de covoiturage. This is somewhere outside of the city of Perpignan where you can park your car on that nice car parking space and hop into somebody else's car to reduce the number of cars that go into Perpignan. And there's a little marché that you can pick your groceries up on the way home. There's some bike parking spaces. It's generally there. It's been set up to enable people to do that. The picture in the middle is a small minibus visiting a station and showing you that you can actually coordinate your bus timetable with your rail timetable. Something that we can be deeply envious of sometimes in the UK. So the options are not all a single bullet. So they're not a single silver bullet, because cars are used for so many different reasons that we also have to have alternatives that meet all of those different reasons and encourage people to look at the difference. I don't think rural people are particularly more keen on cars than urban people. They need the options. But when we get to that situation where cities are choked, we need to look at those urban areas to see where those vehicles are coming from and whether there are carrots to persuade people to use the options when they are there. And the third thing I wanted to say is that alternatives need to be inclusive. Buses at the moment are probably some of the best and most inclusive modes of transport where they exist, because they enable wheelchair access. And at the moment, I think not all rural infrastructure is particularly mobility accessible. So that's me for now, and I hope that's not too long a presentation. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. So we'll come to questions from the audience in a second. I just want to ask you one specific question. Stephen implied in his remarks that there's sometimes a debate around the value of DRT, presumably alongside and complementing conventional public transport. You mentioned, I think, the Hertfordshire Links DRT service. What are the characteristics, in your view, of an effective and successful DRT service, as opposed to one which sounds great but in fact doesn't really work? What is it? How do you design a service to make sure that it's actually a meaningful option and give people the trips that they need?
I think it's a very interesting question, because there are two answers. One is about the usage and how well it's designed in terms of the people that use it, but the other is in terms of the amenity for the people who don't use it. Mm-hmm. I recently saw a petition of 1,800 people for a bus service that had only been used by 213 passengers. And it was going to be axed, 213 passengers, and we're changing it. And 1,800 people have signed a petition to say, no, we don't want that to happen. Right. And I think one of the things that rural bus fulfills is the fallback option. We know that we can use it. We might not use it every day. We might only use it occasionally, but we know it's there. And we have to, I think, sometimes include in our calculations I might use it because I've just had an eye operation and I can't drive, that kind of opportunity, the cost of providing the opportunity to use it, and the reassurance that when you retire and stop driving, maybe there will still be a bus for you. So I think there's a broader, I personally, I think behaviour change is very important, but there is a broad desire for people to have services there, and that needs to sometimes be reflected in the calculations we make about services, because they're not just about who is using them at this particular moment in time. I looked recently, I get a lot of my data from Padan Mobility, and I looked recently at their iTravel service, which covers about 40,000 people in Cheshire, the Cheshire West service. And that was very interesting, because you could see there was a group, about a third of the trips on that were made by the same people very, very regularly. And then you had the group of people who maybe were using it once a week, and then you have the group of people who are using it maybe once a month. And it's a very interesting question. How is that equitable? There's that intense use. Those people who are using it nearly every day, clearly it's essential to them. And then those other people who are using it less frequently, what were their other options? And I think we need to sort of look a little bit at how equitable is the money that we're spending, because something like 39,000 out of 40,000 people in that area could get on that bus because they live within the walking distance of one of the virtual bus stops. So that's an equitable expenditure in terms of per head of that population, and also whereas a fixed line bus, obviously, if you spend £100,000 on subsidy on it, only the people within a 300 metre, 400 metre walk of the bus stops along a particular corridor can use it. So is that equitable in terms of the expenditure? So I think there's an equity and access issue. There's also yes, what about the usage? You know, demand responsive transport, we'll probably see on a good day, you're probably seeing 3-4 people per person hour, 2 to 4 people per vehicle hour, which doesn't sound amazing, but they are small vehicles. So sometimes you'll have 12, sometimes you'll have none. And when you look at the overall, the DFT's published occupancy across the entire bus fleet, the average is only 10 people. So across your double deckers right down to your small ones. So I feel that DRT sits within this, but we always expect it to wash its own face in terms of the amount of fare collected will pay for the service. I don't think that's necessarily possible if you're operating any passenger transport in a rural area. Sorry, that's a very rambling answer.
Great, no, that's fine, really helpful. But it's clearly, you know, it's complex, and actually how it works will obviously vary from area to area as well in terms of what's there and people's patterns of demand, I'm sure. So we'll come to questions now from the audience. Thank you all very much for those presentations and taking those questions from me. So Beata, you made a couple of references to kind of infrastructure design, and Benjamin Coleman's asked whether the Centre of Excellence has looked at the role and importance of what he's called streetscape and urban/rural design in thinking about the meaningful range of choice available to people. And it's interesting because as soon as you start talking about urban design, everyone assumes it's about cities, but clearly the same questions around the accessibility of, the attractiveness of, the safety of your physical environment, footways, waiting areas, connections between different places, for particularly for walking and cycling. To what extent has that come up in your work, and how do we make sure that the local authorities have got the requisite design skills? Because they've probably got highway engineers who know how to design highways, but may not additionally have that kind of urban design perspective. What's your sense of how important that is?
Yeah, I'd say, Ben, our research definitely showed that this is a concern for people. Lots of people who responded said they do want to reduce their car dependency and improve their carbon footprint associated with vehicle use, but the provision of and the maintenance of any existing infrastructure is a challenge. And they felt that was one of the reasons that they couldn't make a decision to choose how they travelled. You know, we're seeing a lot more people with e-bikes and power-assisted bikes, which would enable them to travel further. And, you know, as Beata said about accessing rural train stations, yeah, most of them you would have to drive to unless you live incredibly close. But I think it's also things like lack of street lighting, you know, higher speed limits on rural roads as well that impact. So it's nothing new. I would hope that the government's commitment to a new road safety strategy would also help with that and bring that back in. And I don't think it's necessarily a lack of knowledge in local authorities. I would say my, you know, highway engineers generally are very intuitive to what's needed. A lot of it is down to regulation, design guidance, and that's why I think I would really welcome the advent of the Active Travel England rural design guidance when it comes forward, so that actually local authorities have the confidence to do some of these changes in rural areas, you know, with some guidance in place rather than relying on national, more urban guidance.
Brilliant, thank you. Stephen, one of our audience, Belinda Borden, is an elected member of a rural unitary authority. She's asked, or she's made the point that local authorities in rural areas are currently, at least, at the mercy of bus operators who essentially run services where it suits them, unless they're subsidised by the local authority in terms of commercial revenue. They cut services, claiming lack of drivers or lack of profitability, whatever the reason is. To what extent do you think the gradual rollout of bus franchising, for example, might help deal with the kind of uncertainty of rural bus services, which must be part of the reason why people don't kind of trust them as an available form of transport?
Yes, I've been responding to some of to Belinda in the chat, actually. Yes, so the franchising is being promised. I mean, Belinda was saying, is there support? Well, actually, the powers haven't yet even been. I don't think the bill's even been published, so we don't know what the condition what conditions are attached to it, and we certainly don't know until the budget and beyond what money will be available for it. Though, as I said, I rather hope that if the Prime Minister has spotted that buses are important for older people as well, that might involve some money. That's so we don't yet know, but it's clear that authorities will need support, particularly rural unitaries like Belinda's in Dorset. These are they're going to need support in getting some kind of franchising, or even doing enhanced partnerships, actually get those off the ground. Cornwall, which I talked about, and actually Belinda, since she's not that far away, might want to go and have a look at what they've been doing there. Did what they've done through in a partnership, but with a sort of franchising opportunity in a Cornwall devolution deal as a sort of backstop. But I think some of the things they've done, of, as I say, making the buses, meet the trains, have interchanges at stations, and so on, are things that could be done by other, are applicable in other rural areas. I think the opportunity through, I think that the issue, as I was about to say, was that to Belinda actually in the chat, I think we're going to need to see what franchising models look like in rural areas, see what will work for them. It may not be the same as the model in London or Manchester. It might be different. But we will, I think that the point that Beata and others have made, we're going to need some money for this, for rural transport. Actually, one of the things that I've noticed about the DLT story, it isn't just that people are expecting it to wash its face, as Beata said. People are also putting out completely unrealistic contracts. I remember one talking to, not Padam, but another provider a year or two back, who said that they were being asked to bid for by a rural authority to provide an amazingly, half-hour response service in a huge area with 3 buses. And I think people, that's utterly unrealistic. And I think we've got to see realistic contracts for this. I think we're going to need to just see how the franchising and the government's bus reform strategies roll out. But I think there are opportunities there, and opportunities to learn from other people, from what's already been done, as I said, in places like Cornwall.
Brilliant. So I'm conscious of time. I'm afraid we're actually almost at time, and I'm sure we could go on for many more hours, given the number of questions in the chat and the level of interest in the topic. I'm going to abuse my position as chair by asking you all a final question. We know now that the government is going to produce an integrated transport strategy, something we haven't seen for many years, since John Prescott tried doing that back in the late 1990s. We know that Danny Williams has been appointed to head up that role in DFT. What would each of you want to see in the government's integrated transport strategy in relation to rural transport and improving its quality and reliability and affordability for people living in rural areas? Sharon, I'm going to unfairly come to you first.
Okay, thank you. I think, affordability is a big issue. We've got people who are in low-income households living in rural areas. We've got social mobility in rural areas that is impacted by lack of travel or ability to travel, especially if you think about young people not necessarily being able to go to sixth form, further education, choose courses that they actually want to do because of the distance that they need to travel. Life choices are impacted by this in many areas. Some people have said that minimum level of service for rural areas would be good, in terms of transport provision. I think as Stephen alluded to, that depends on contracts, how things are organised as well. But better integration would mean that people don't have to always default to the car. And I think working with transport operators, for example, to make sure that, you know, the buses do meet the trains, which seems quite simple and yet seems to still be happening in so many places as well. And routing services that they actually go to where people need to go rather than leaving them, you know, with another, as Beata said, you know, 2 or 3 kilometre walk to access the next part of their journey. You know, it's a multimodal journey, but perhaps we could reduce the number of stages that are needed. You're on mute, Ben.
Thank you. School child error. Beata, what would you want to see in the integrated transport strategy on rural transport?
I think I'd love to see rural transport being taken in a regional context so that it's not leaving the rural piece separate. It's about the impact between rural and peri-urban areas and cities, and some kind of regional settlement that has some kind of parity for people in cities with people in rural areas, because it impacts, you know, the lack of transport in rural areas impacts people in city centres, because those are the people that are increasing traffic levels. You know, if you're riding your cargo bike in central London and trying to live a car-free lifestyle, it must be very confusing to find that you're always being run over by someone in an SUV from somewhere slightly less well provided for, and so that calculation needs to be done as part of the integrated transport strategy, and the way in which governance and equity is set up in the current sort of transport structures or transport governance structures.
Brilliant. We'll make sure we send these notes to Danny. Stephen, lastly to you, what do you want to see in the transport strategy?
Given time, I'll be quick. Long-term funding, settlements at a regional level in the way that Beata was talking about. But I also think work with those generating travel, with employers, with schools and colleges, with universities even, since I'm from one, and also leisure providers, leisure areas, because if we can work with those people, you can find ways of reducing travel in the way that Mobility Ways and others have shown they can do, and provide more choices for people.
Fantastic. We are unfortunately at time. Very briefly, to try and summarise what we've just heard in the last hour, which has been fantastic. So there's a substantial population of people, 10 million, if not more, currently not very well served by the transport in their rural areas. Rural transport has traditionally been the poor relative of transport policy and funding. I think we've heard those people have a right to, as in France is legally enshrined, a right to a decent level of access to the things they need to get access to through rural transport services. And that's particularly important for households on low incomes or facing other kinds of disadvantage, who are multiply disadvantaged by the fact they can't get to where they need to get to. Lots of potential practical examples of what works in rural areas. And as Beata's pointed out, connecting rural transport with urban transport so that that's seen as a system, not as 2 separate systems. What we need is better understanding of what's going on, better understanding of what works, the creation of capacity and governance at regional and local level to plan and deliver this transport or commission it, long-term funding, reliable funding, both capital and revenue, and above all, a commitment to make the transport system in rural areas work as well as it does, certainly in some urban areas. Stephen, Sharon, Beata, thank you so much for your presentations and answering all those questions. As I say, we could have gone on for many hours more, I'm sure. And I would encourage any of you who are feeling cheated to come to Transport Planning Day on the 11th of November, either in London at the Institute of Civil Engineers or online. And if you're not a member of the Transport Planning Society and you've enjoyed today's events, I would encourage you to join the society as well. But meanwhile, have a fantastic afternoon, and thanks very much again for joining the call.